Hi everyone, welcome to this match in the Octo-Finals round of the International Reparations Debate Competition for 2026. My name is Jermaine Barrett and I have the privilege to serve as your chair adjudicator in this match. I'm going to now invite my panelists to introduce themselves, beginning with Dejane.
Good morning, everyone. I am Dejane Fagan, and I look forward to a very spirited debate. All the best, teams.
Thank you very much, Dejane, and over to you, Jason.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Williams. Looking forward to hearing from everyone today.
Thank you so very much. All right, so you've met our adjudicators. It's now time for us to meet our teams, and we have two teams. One from Merl Grove High School out of Jamaica, and they're going up against Rawlins Academy out of the United Kingdom. So we're going to invite now the proposition team to introduce themselves.
Good day, I'm Clara Byford and I'm the second speaker.
I'm Aisha Basari and I'm the first speaker.
I'm Edith Marshall and I'm the third speaker.
All right, thank you very much, Rawlins College. Let us now meet our opposition team from Merl Grove High School. Merl Grove?
Good day, everyone. My name is Astarte Montague, and I'm your first speaker.
My name is Sanjay Nelson, and I will be the second speaker of the opposition.
My name is Ashanti Rodway, and I will be the reply speaker for the opposition team.
And we are Merl Grove High School.
Indeed, thank you so very much, Merl Grove High School. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this competition is powered by some fantastic partners and sponsors, and we always delight in just bringing them to you. So we'll do that just now. Jason, uh, please tell our viewing audience who our partners and sponsors are.
Okay, so our partners and sponsors, first, of course, is the University of the West Indies. There's the Center for Reparation Research. There's the UWI Press. There's Jade. There's the University of Hull. And of course, our main partner, the Repair Campaign as well.
Thank you so very, very much. All right, so let's just remind ourselves uh, uh, as to the rules of this contest. So you would have just been introduced to the three debaters on each team. Each debater has a different amount of time within which they'll be presenting. So the first speaker will speak for 7 minutes, the second speaker for 6 minutes, and the third and final speaker will speak for 5 minutes. After the first pair of speakers, we'll have the cross-examination segment, and then we'll have another cross-examination segment in the second phase after the second pair of presentations from the debaters. Then we will pause for 1 minute and then we'll conclude with those 5 minute speeches from the reply speakers or the third speakers from either team, beginning with the opposition team, concluding with the proposition team. All right. Of course, we have periods of protected time, and I'm going to ask Jason to just do the honors of making notes in the chat to indicate when it is that the debaters have spoken for 1 minute and when they have 1 minute to go. In between those two time signals, points of information are encouraged from the opposing team. And of course, when they've spoken for their allotted time, they'll get that signal as well with 15 seconds extra within which they must conclude. All right. So, Jason, we have a debate on our hand. Let us hear the motion that will govern today's match.
Okay, so today's motion is this House believes identity should be rooted in the societies created after slavery rather than ancestral homelands.
All right, fantastic motion that is. And so we now call upon the first speaker, the Prime Minister, who hails from Rawlins Academy, to open this debate. Go right ahead, Prime Minister.
Good day, esteemed judges, timekeeper, and members of the opposition. Imagine a world where identity is rooted in ancestral homelands, a world that dismisses the progress of Black communities have built since enslavement, ignores the trauma of being violently taken from West Africa, and even labels Afro-Caribbean, African-American, and other diaspora identities as illegitimate, and all because they don't match a past that can never be recovered. Now imagine a world where identity is rooted in post-enslavement societies, a world that strengthens the cultures created out of survival and resistance, grounds people in the real progress their communities have built, and forms an identity powerful enough to fight for change on its own terms. This is why this House believes identity should be rooted into societies created after enslavement rather than ancestral homelands. Now I'd like to define a few of our key terms. We define culture as everything that influences your actions, beliefs, mindset, and day-to-day life. Culture is passed through communities and down generations and shapes just about everything you do and everything around you. We also define rooted as being firmly established or influenced by something, and that is the primary cause of something's existence, and identity as a set of unique qualities and traits of an individual, shaped by culture, societal norms, relationships, and how they are perceived by both themselves and others. Our first argument in favour of the motion is that rooting identity in ancestral homelands erases the progress built by the descendants of the enslaved. It's generally recognised that culture is not static. When the social, political, or environmental climate changes, culture changes with it. We see an example of culture being developed during enslavement with slave songs and cornrows or cane rows. Slave songs like Wade in the Water or I'll Fly Away shared advice, created a sense of community, and lifted spirits in a society that denied the enslaved autonomy. It also influenced music styles today in the Caribbean, such as reggae and calypso. And cornrows or cane rows were used to map out escape routes to give the enslaved a chance at freedom, and these are examples of how culture was made during enslavement. And they are a huge part of identity for many people in the Caribbean now. Furthermore, post-enslavement societies are where
Point of information.
Point of information accepted.
If identity is rooted only in post-slavery societies, how do you address the fact that those societies were shaped by colonizers to suppress ancestral cultures?
Can you repeat the question, please?
If identity is rooted only in post-slavery societies, how do you address the fact that those societies were shaped by colonizers to suppress ancestral cultures?
Well, although it's not, we believe that identity is not solely rooted in just after enslavement, and part of it is from the ancestral homelands. But that does not mean that is the only thing it relies on. It's simply the primary thing is that post-enslavement societies. Post-enslavement societies are where descendants rebuilt their lives, cultures, and political agency. This was not simply inherited intact from Africa. Political progress happened in post-slavery societies. Civil rights, independence movements, and anti-racist struggles were fought on the soil where descendants actually lived. To center identity in the past is to overlook the progress carved out in the present. The Caribbean was not built by geography or genetics, but the determination and strength of the formerly enslaved and their descendants. The labor rebellions of the 1930s, the Morant Bay Rebellion, and other movements that shaped the Caribbean today happened in post-enslavement societies. To prioritize ancestral homelands risks diminishing the resistance against oppression from the enslaved, from those who survived and rebuilt to those who defied the former colonizers. By preserving culture in ways that aren't always obvious, they significantly developed how culture and identity are perceived by both Caribbeans and other nations alike today. The identity of millions has been and will continue to be influenced by history and future effects. There is no denying this. And to class all this culture as secondary to geography classes all the efforts, progress, and strength of the descendants of the enslaved as secondary. It implies that culture forged under oppression and identities formed by struggle are somehow less real or less legitimate, which is not true at all. Identity should reflect the communities that the descendants built with their own hands. Another reason that we agree with the motion is that rooting identity in ancestral homelands ignores the trauma and rupture of enslavement. Enslavement deliberately severed ancestral ties. Languages, names, religions, and lineages were violently erased. Despite this, the descendants of the enslaved still rebuilt and recovered. But that does not mean the damage does not affect society today. Many descendants cannot trace their ancestry, not because they don't care, but because the records were destroyed. Pretending these ties severed by the former colonizers can simply be restored ignores the depth of that trauma.
Points of information.
Point of information accepted.
If identity is defined solely by post-slavery societies, are you suggesting Caribbean nations should accept the political and economic hierarchies left by colonialism?
No, identity and culture is not solely rooted in post-colonial and post-enslavement structures, but that is a huge part of it and is primarily rooted in. These movements emerged in the diaspora, not Africa. To dismiss them and clear the consequences of enslavement and say they do not affect today does not heal any trauma, it suppresses it. Identity comes from true healing and experience rather than solely biology or environmental factors. Acknowledging the impacts enslavement had and continues to have on identity acknowledges the harm done and helps move forward. Not doing so only causes more harm. To propose identity can simply be restored or rooted in a society before enslavement blatantly disregards how deeply the formerly enslaved and their descendants continue to be affected. Identity is made up of everything around you, the people, the things, and the history. Rooting identity in post-enslavement societies acknowledges the rupture honestly. It does not force people to pretend the past is recoverable in full. The trauma born from enslavement cannot be undone, but it can be embraced. A unique blend of African and European culture has developed in the Caribbean, proof of how trauma was processed and survived in post-enslavement societies, rather than being ignored altogether. The solution is not to ignore how directly intertwined they are with the after-effects of enslavement, but to accept it. These are the communities where people rebuilt families, created culture, and fought for dignity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister. We now call upon the Leader of the Opposition, who hails from Merl Grove High School, to present their substantives. Hear, hear.
Hi, good morning. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so before I begin my speech, I'd like to address some of the bogus claims made by the proposition. The first speaker said that the opposition stance dismisses progress Black communities have made. But really, what progress have we had? We're still economically dependent on our own colonial powers. We have a trauma mindset by thinking that Black is bad. Additionally, European cultures that were imposed upon us, the Caribbean, are still evident, being the education system, religion, and even the Creole, which is a mix of European and African, while the Caribbean still speaks British Standard English. Marcus Mosiah Garvey once said, "A people without knowledge of their past, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." This quote emphasizes that understanding one's heritage is essential for identity, survival, and growth. Without this foundation, people are vulnerable, unable to thrive, and lack a sense of belonging. Good day, esteemed panel of adjudicators, teammates, fellow debaters, my worthy opponents, and audience members. I'm Astarte Montague, the opposition leader for today's match. Under the motion, this House believes identity should not be rooted in societies created after slavery, rather than ancestral homelands, which we strongly disagree with. I'd like to thank the proposition for opening this match with the definition of key terms in the motion, which we'll use. Although it is important to note that Caribbean societies are multicultural and many groups were displaced or migrated from different parts of the world. Because of this, identity cannot be rooted only in post-slavery societies. It must also acknowledge ancestral homelands that shaped people's cultural heritage. For this match, I'll focus on the cultural and economical aspect by speaking on cultural erasure, cultural amnesia, reparatory justice. My second speaker will do the political aspect, and my third speaker will finish off by summarizing all the points, rebutting the proposition's claims, while speaking on the social aspect, further emphasizing why we have won this debate. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, post-slavery Caribbean societies were structured during colonial rule in ways that reshaped and suppressed the cultural identities of many groups. Colonial powers imposed European languages, religions, and social systems on populations that lived in the region, including indigenous peoples, Africans who were forcefully transported during the transatlantic slave trade, indentured laborers, and later migrant communities. This reality is seen in the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice, point 7 specifically, which explains how colonialism forced European culture onto Caribbean societies while distancing people from their original cultural roots. The process attempted to replace the diverse traditions, beliefs, and identities that existed before colonial domination. This idea is also supported by Caribbean sociologist George Beckford through his plantation society model. Beckford argued that Caribbean societies were shaped by a plantation system created during slavery, where economic, social, and cultural structures were designed to serve colonial powers. Even after emancipation, these societies continue to reflect the values and hierarchies established during slavery. Example of this can be seen now in Caribbean societies through skin bleaching, dependency on foreign trades and goods, animosity among cultural and social groups, weak manufacturing, and inequality and discrimination against the poor. To address this, we must begin accepted.
You previously said that there was no real progress made in the Caribbean. Do you not consider emancipation progress?
Emancipation may be progress, but yet still identity, we still haven't moved past the things that the Europeans, colonizers, imposed upon us, like religion. To address this, we must begin by re-educating our people to dismantle the anything black no good mentality that colonialism created, starting with a deeper understanding of our ancestral history. Slavery wasn't a mere system, it was a genocide characterized by organized propaganda that transformed our society into a cultural hegemony that Antonio Gramsci described as a domination of society through the manipulation of cultures, beliefs, and values so that their worldview is accepted through common sense. This meant that identities of enslaved Africans were systematically reconstructed to align with colonial expectations, replacing ancestral histories with identities shaped by plantocracy. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, if identity is rooted solely in societies created after slavery, we risk continuing the cultural erasure and colonialism produced. Instead, acknowledging ancestral homelands allows individuals and communities to reconnect with the cultural roots that our colonial systems attempted to suppress. Secondly, how identity without ancestral memory leads to cultural amnesia and weakens, not accepted, weakens historical justice. Without connection to ancestral homelands, descendants of enslaved people lose historical consciousness. Before the transatlantic slave trade, many African societies were thriving civilizations with advanced systems of trade, governance, art, and education, such as the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire. However, the violence of the Middle Passage and plantation slavery stripped millions of Africans of their identities, languages, and histories, replacing them with identities imposed by colonial powers. When identity is rooted only in societies created after slavery, we risk forgetting the rich civilizations our ancestors came from and reducing our history to slavery alone. This cultural amnesia weakens the historical consciousness necessary to pursue justice and reparations for the crimes committed against our ancestors. Which leads me to my final point. Reclaiming ancestral identity strengthens the economic case for reproductive justice. Slavery was not merely a system of oppression, but a massive economic enterprise in which Africans were violently captured through the transatlantic slave trade, transported during the Middle Passage, and forced into brutal plantation labor that generated immense wealth for European powers. However, this wealth was extracted from the Caribbean and reinvested abroad, leaving the region economically underdeveloped. By reconnecting with ancestral identity, descendants gain the historical awareness necessary to challenge its legacy of exploitation and strengthen global movements demanding reparation for the economic injustices created by slavery. These reasons show how ridiculous it is for my opponents to say we should root identity into systems built up and imposed on us by our colonizers, forgetting the reparations movement we tried so hard to fight for. The opposition temporarily rests. But I'll take the POIs if you have any. If I have the time.
We would just like to suggest, do you believe that suffering and colonialism has impacted culture and identity? And are you suggesting that the history of suffering does not impact identity?
Did you repeat the question?
We would like to suggest that suffering and colonialism, as tragic as it is part of identity. And are you suggesting that the history of suffering does not inform culture and identity?
That's exactly what I'm suggesting, is that the history of suffering and colonialism does impact identity. But your stance is supposed to be that identity should completely be rooted in societies created after slavery, while we're saying that majority of citizens do not understand or know about anything that is happening or like why they deserve reparatory justice. Next POI. Oh no, sorry, it's time.
We thank you very much, Madam Leader of the Opposition, coming to us there from Merl High School. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move to the first segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the opposition team, Team Merl High School, gets to ask 3 questions of the proposition team, Team Rawlins Academy. Of course, each of those questions are limited to, is limited to 10 seconds, each response limited to 45 seconds. We then flip and allow Rawlins Academy to ask their 3 questions of Merl Grove thereafter. All right, so Merl Grove, you are up with your first three questions. Your three questions.
Okay. Many Caribbean people are descendants of Africans, Indians, and Chinese and Europeans. How can a single post-slavery society fully define all of these ancestral identities?
We are suggesting that a post-slavery society does not need to fully define all of these identities, but has instead formed its own unique identity, yes, with a basis in these cultures, but it does not need to define every culture from which it stems. It needs to create its own culture for the sake of liberation and for the sake of a progressive future.
Okay. If identity is only based on post-slavery societies, how do you ensure younger generations understand the historical suffering?
Identity is not solely based on post-enslavement societies, and although it is primarily in there because it is deeply rooted in the history that has happened, it does not mean that ancestral homelands are irrelevant, just that they aren't as integral to identity. And education is still very important, and we think that that's why it's such a big part of identity is the history, which is why it needs to be taught about.
Would you agree that many Caribbean cultural practices such as music, religion, and language have strong African and Asian influences?
They do, but they also have roots, as you have mentioned, in the former colonizers that came over to the Caribbean. These songs, things, and many parts of culture that have been created stem from the mix of these, which this mix has created a whole new culture, which has showed itself in post-slavery society.
So follow-up question, if these influences...
Thank you, Merl Grove. Sorry, I think you only have three questions. I believe you've asked all three. And it is now time for us to hear the three questions from Rawlins Academy.
West Africa is made up of hundreds of different ethnicities. How do you suggest people in the Caribbean find the ethnicity they are descended from when so many records were destroyed?
It doesn't have to be a physical geographical location. Persons can find identity in Africa as a whole because the Europeans took persons from all different sorts of Africa. So as in knowing about your identity from all the African tribes are mostly like something that and there's DNA evidence to say where exactly you came from.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah.
Do you think then that we can just generalize, say, West African and Asian cultures? Because if identity of the Caribbean can be found in all West African cultures, then that seems to make them a monolith.
Identity of the Caribbean cannot be found only in West Africa because we're a melting pot. We're comprised of Indians, Chinese, and multiple different cultures. So it cannot be based on West Africa alone. It should be based on ancestral homelands. Ancestral homelands can be either from China, India, Africa, and so on. So,
do you think Afro-Caribbean and African-American identities are illegitimate when compared to an identity based on ancestral homelands?
No, we're not necessarily. Could you repeat the question?
Do you think Afro-Caribbean and African-American identities are less legitimate when compared to identities based in ancestral homelands?
No, they're not less illegitimate, or no, they're not illegitimate overall. But the case is that persons were taken from their homelands or had the choice or had the voluntary choice to go to the Caribbean, and their beliefs and their identities were imposed upon them by European colonies, such as the way that we speak or our religion and multiple other aspects, the education system. So basically we're saying that we don't want to have identity rooted in something that was imposed upon us forcefully.
Thank you very much, Rawlins Academy, rather. And thank you, Merl Grove at High School, for those questions and answers. We move on now. At this time, let us make welcome the Deputy Prime Minister who hails from Rawlins Academy.
Thank you. Good day. I'm Clara Byford, and I would begin to rebut the arguments made by the opposition. The opposition state that no real progress has been made. The Caribbean has been emancipated from slavery. They have moved on. They have built societies, built infrastructure that we admit needs improvement. But the idea that this is not progress is wrong. This is progress. Secondly, they emphasize that post-slavery societies should be based off Africa or other places, but we would like to specifically cite Africa. Africa is generalized by the opposition as one singular place, a place with a singular culture, a singular identity. When many of these countries, the whole of West Africa, has hundreds of different places, hundreds of different identities. The idea that they are generalized is an issue in itself that Africa continually faces when it is generalized. Secondly, they also state that we could use DNA tests to take exact origin. This is wrong because, as I will state now in our first argument, DNA tests are generalized, regionalized estimates. They do not tell you the exact ethnic group that you came from. They do not tell you these things. Anywhere in the world, any genetic test can tell you are Indian. Are you South Indian? Are you from one part of China? Are you from another? These diverse countries in themselves that have such diverse identities cannot be merged into one. Therefore, we cannot base it in a homeland because these homelands are so diverse in themselves. Going back to the idea of them being based in West Africa, many of the former enslaved, they cannot find their past identities due to the fact that it was severed by enslavery. They erase names, languages, family structures. Ancestral identity often becomes reconstructed rather than inherited. We quote the University of South Carolina that says African Americans lack ancestral information spanning several centuries. This is from a genetic ancestral study. There is no way to exactly trace ethnic identity. DNA ancestry tests, as I have
Point of
stated,
information.
are broad and do not precise, leading people to overinterpret vague percentages, such as 12% Nigerian, which does not determine your ethnic identity. Point of information accepted.
If culture in the Caribbean is influenced by African and Asian cultures, how can identity be rooted only in post-slavery societies?
I restate the motion. It says it is rooted. Rooted means primarily influenced. By it being primarily influenced, we argue that the main layer is post-slavery societies. The main layer is the culture, the songs, everything that was created after enslavement, and that shows the progress and the way that the Caribbean has bounced back after enslavement, rather than it being based in the trauma and from the homelands, which the sever that was cut can never be fully recovered. Continuing on the point that this was severed, the idea that they can be from a homeland such as West Africa is simply a slightly stupid idea because they can never be fully reconnected. You can never completely recover the trauma that was done when people were taken from their past identities.
Point of information.
You also dismiss the idea that the West African cultures and identities have changed over time as they have been through completely different things compared to the post-slavery societies. It also becomes selective, with individuals choosing their culture they find appealing rather than those they truly descend from. We acknowledge that identity is chosen, but a part of ancestral identity is that it's fixed and determined by where you came from. Many diaspora individuals adopt symbols, clothing, spiritual practices that are Pan-African blends, not tied to any ancestral group. We agree this is a part of identity, but we agree the main part of identity is where you live, the structure you live in. Point of information accepted.
So you were saying that we cannot base identity in West Africa or ancestral homelands due to it being old and we shouldn't say in the past. But how do you account for, do you think that we should base identity in a place that is completely like imposed upon us by the colonial powers?
You have exhausted the allotted time for your point of information.
Okay.
Go ahead, second speaker.
The idea it is completely based in former colonial powers is wrong. Yes, the former colonial powers took over. Yes, they caused enslavement, but the former enslaved, the slaves who lived through enslavement, they created songs. They've created denominations of Christianity that are individual to post-enslavement. The idea that you would consider that they are not direct connections and they are not post-enslavement is ridiculous because the Caribbean identity is a blend of different identities, as you have stated. It is not simply Europeans having complete control. It's not simply a European identity replicated in the Caribbean. It is completely different. Furthermore, identity should be grounded in a society where you hold political agency. People from the Caribbean cannot vote, change anything in their homeland. Very few have citizenship due to enslavement. So how are we supposed to say they can have political agency, have power? How are we supposed to say that it empowers people if truly they can have no power over where they came from and only power in where they live now, in where they live, where they are? The future is shaped by the society you inhabit, not the one your ancestors were taken from. Identity must therefore be rooted in the place shaping your destiny, the place shaping your future, the place you can set up protests for your rights, the place you can find justice. Thank you.
We thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister from Rawlins Academy. We now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to advance the opposition's case. Of course, they hail from Merl High School.
I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Before I begin, I would like to point out that the preposition has just contradicted their own stance. The motion clearly states that identity should be rooted in societies created after slavery rather than ancestral homelands. Yet the preposition themselves admit that Caribbean identity is not solely rooted in the post-colonial societies. If that is the case, then they are acknowledging that ancestral heritage still plays a vital role in identity. In doing so, they are effectively supporting our stance on the motion. Also, if we have moved on, why are we still seeking reparations? Good morning, adjudicators and members of the preposition. My name is Sanjay Donaldson, and I firmly oppose the move. This House believes identity should be rooted in societies created after slavery rather than ancestral homelands. Members of the House, the preposition asks us to root Caribbean identity primarily in societies created after slavery, but by doing so means grounding who we are in systems that were deliberately designed to erase us. Identity is not merely cultural, it is political. It shapes power, resources, and human rights. We see this clearly in territories like Martinique and Guadeloupe, which were integrated into the French state under the 1946 departmentalization law, while presenting as equality. This integration keeps these societies embedded within French governance structures rather than granting their true self-determination. Rooting identity solely in post-slavery societies therefore risks legitimizing political systems constructed through colonial domination. Furthermore, limiting our identity to plantation societies isolates us from the broader struggles of the diaspora. Afro-Caribbean people are not simply descendants of enslaved individuals. We are members of a global community, still confronting imperialism and neocolonialism. Consider Burkina Faso, where recent movements challenge economic dependence on France and the CFA franc. These struggles mirror Caribbean experiences where our economies remain tied to external financial institutions. Limiting identity to post-slavery societies separates our struggle from others fighting the same systems of control. Accepted at this time? Reconnecting with answer. Go ahead.
You say that we contradict ourselves, but you said that you agree with our definitions. Our definition of rooted being is firmly established or influenced by something, which we did argue. So are you not contradicting yourselves as you argue rooted as being something different?
But rooted means solely, and your stance is supposed to be that you agree that primarily it is in identity should be identified with post-colonial societies. But you're saying it's not solely, so you're saying it's not primarily, and therefore you are contradicting yourselves. Continuing on. Reconnecting with ancestral homelands allows Caribbean societies to become part of a broader movement for sovereignty and development. These ancestral connections extend beyond Africa. The Caribbean diaspora also includes descendants from India and China, whose cultures and histories have shaped Caribbean societies. Strengthening relationships with these regions offer clear economic advantages. According to the United Economics Commission for Africa, Africa has a population exceeding 1.4 billion people, projected to reach 2.5 billion by 2050, making it one of the fastest growing regions in the world. Yet CARICOM's trade with Africa remains less than 1%, meaning significant economic opportunities remain untapped. This cooperation has yet already begun. In 2025, Jamaica joined the African Export-Import Bank, unlocking a approximately $1.5 billion in financing for Jamaica and other Caribbean economies, and raising the bank's facility for the region to $3 billion. According to its president, Benedict, nearly $1 billion in projects across tourism, infrastructure, ports, and creative industries are already underway. The Caribbean is a melting pot of various cultures and traditions from around the world. Partnerships with other ancestral homelands such as China also demonstrate how collaboration with stronger economies can support Caribbean development. Chinese investments in highways, port construction projects across the region generate jobs and strengthen infrastructure. Similarly, deepening ties with India expands opportunities in education, technology, and pharmaceuticals. If we root our identities in post-slavery societies, we risk removing the value of shared heritage, creating division in the Caribbean, and weakening the regional partnerships and corporations that have benefited us since achieving independence. It is also shared history that keeps CARICOM together. Small nations which on their own are not strong enough compete economically and politically on a global scale together, have achieved much. Therefore, rooting ourselves in our ancestral homelands will strengthen our political and economical power, resulting in more political pressure being placed on former colonizers for reparations. J.K. Rowling once said, "We are only as strong as we are united, as weak as we are divided. Our shared experience in political, social, and economic injustices perpetuated by former colonizers allows for us to be more unified and puts more pressure on former colonizers to partake in reparatory justice." Members of the House, rooting identity in ancestral connections does not reject Caribbean culture. It simply acknowledges that our story did not begin with slavery and should not end with slavery. Movements such as Pan-Africanism, championed by Marcus Garvey, understood that unity across the diaspora strengthens our ability to challenge injustices and demand reparations. Therefore, it is imperative that we strengthen our economical and political ties with ancestral homelands. The opposition temporarily rests.
We thank you very much, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. We now move to the second segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the only difference really, is that the proposition team Rawlins Academy, gets to ask questions first of the opposition team, and then we will flip after that is done. So Rawlins College, you are up, and of course, be mindful of the time restrictions regarding questions and answers.
Thank you. Your argument was heavily economic. Are you suggesting that identity and culture is somehow based in economy, when truly identity and culture is based in connections, relationships, food, and many other aspects of non-economic life?
Could you repeat, please?
Much of your argument was heavily based in economy. However, we do not believe that the economy is identity. And are you suggesting that the economic health of a nation is what determines its identity?
First of all, what we're trying to say is that by identifying with our ancestral homelands, we will strengthen our economic and political success, which is what we aim to achieve with reparations. It is to be advanced economically and politically as a nation, as a region.
And also in my speech, I did mention cultural ties and what makes cultural thing.
Do you not believe that that you mentioned Indian, China, and people with African roots? Do you not agree that they have formed a post-slavery society based on the shared history of servitude and enslavement?
They did technically make a society created from the different cultural heritage that they bring to the island or the Caribbean region, but majority of their cultures were suppressed by European powers and colonies.
And also, majority of their culture was influenced from their traditions that they brought over with them from their ancestral homelands. A lot of their traditions came and migrated with them. They passed it down to future generations today.
For example, the Whale in the Water song that you brought up, that stemmed from Africa. Those music stem from Africa. Songs that were sung on the plantations by slaves, that came from Africa.
Do you not think that cultures could mix, evolve, and be formed over time?
Cultures can mix, evolve, and be formed over time, but yet still in this society today, we still have mental trauma from what happened during slavery, and we still follow up with colonialism, with our education system and the way in which we speak.
As well as foundationally, we are still tied to our ancestral homelands, especially when it comes to, for example, Creole. Creole is a mixture of African languages with French, English, Portuguese, Spanish. It is European. It is foundationally in line, rooted with our ancestral homeland. So even though it shifted over time, we are still rooted with our ancestral.
All right, thank you very much, Rawlins Academy, for those questions. Thanks as well to Merl Grove High School for those responses. Merl Grove, you may now ask your questions of Rawlins Academy.
By focusing only on societies after slavery, are you not forcing Caribbean people to define themselves by the trauma of their ancestors rather than their heritage?
We are not forcing Caribbean people to define themselves by the trauma of their ancestors. We are saying that Caribbean culture should be based in a forward-looking outlook and not looking for a potential homeland. And it should be based in the new identities and the rich culture, which is distinct from the homeland, that has developed within the Caribbean. And we are also suggesting that the suffering and the bravery of the former enslaved should be taken into account and has influenced post-slavery society.
Are you not suggesting by a homeland that people's identity should be rooted and be before enslavement and pre-enslavement, therefore asking them to forget enslavement and try and remove the trauma from their lives?
Can society impose on people by colonial powers truly define who they are?
So why would you suggest that society and culture has been imposed on people? Yes, there are still structures of slavery, but these do not define culture, nor do they define identity. Identity is both personal and based in family, and therefore identity hasn't been imposed by the colonizer. It has been developed by the bravery and the community post-slavery.
All these communities made after enslavement by people in the Caribbean should be recognized as a valid part of identity.
The root of identity.
The CARICOM 10-point reparations plan, point 7 specifically, does speak about how European colonies took our culture, but African cultures and beliefs and identities and imposed theirs on us and suppressed our cultures. And you just said a while ago that there isn't any.
Sorry, excuse me. You're only allowed to ask questions at this time. So sorry. That was Merl Grove responding. All right. Okay.
Can I pose my
All
last question?
Yes,
Sure.
you may ask your last question.
You argue for rooting identity in Caribbean societies, but how does that prevent structural dependence on former colonizers' economic systems?
We do not suggest that Caribbean culture being rooted in post-slavery means that the Caribbean should be connected financially and economically to its colonizers. Instead, we suggest that rooted in post-slavery means that Caribbean culture should be connected to the suffering, to the joy, and to the long history of the Caribbean post-slavery. We suggest that, in fact, their post-slavery culture will be even richer when they are financially disconnected from their colonizers and are able to become independent, completely independent nations from both the homeland and the colonizer.
Furthermore, you suggest obviously that this is a mix of different cultures, but that have mixed together and formed their own culture. For example, India, China, Africa, as you have cited. every single culture comes from a mix of people from different homelands, including British, who comes from a different French and Norman cultures. They have then formed their own identity and their own culture. So therefore, the idea that the fact that these are from different homelands is irrelevant, because
Well, thank you
most
very much,
identities—
Rawlins. You have exhausted the 45 seconds allotted for your responses. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to an end for this segment of cross-examination. We will now pause for 1 minute, after which we will receive the final presentation from Rawlins, no, sorry, not Rawlins, from Merl High School, and then we will conclude with the presentation finally from Rawlins Academy. Your 1 minute pause begins now. All right, teams, your 1 minute pause has elapsed. We are now ready to hear from the third speaker from Merl High School. The third speaker is allotted 5 minutes within which to deliver their presentation. Let us make that speaker welcome. Hear, hear.
I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I begin my speech, I would like to address the ludicrous points brought up by the proposition. The proposition continue to put words in our mouths. We're not asking anyone to produce DNA tests or pinpoint an exact village, because ancestral identity can be understood through culture and civilization, not just bloodlines. Diaspora communities all over the world maintain strong identities with the perfect records. And the reason many of us can't trace back exact origin is because colonial violence that deliberately destroyed information. The proposition then stated a world that dismisses the progress of the Caribbean. Proposition: who is dismissing the progress of the Caribbean? Is it who honor the roots that enable it, or who are those who demand we freeze identity? In the post-slavery era, that was built on erasure. If enslaved people were rarely recorded by name, and most descendants cannot trace family lines before the 1870 census because of the deliberate omission, is it contradictory to celebrate progress while using colonial erasure as a pretext to cut off ancestry? The USC Standard Study documents this genealogy break clearly. Progress doesn't require amnesia about how break was produced. The proposition then stated culture is not static. If culture flows, why insist we anchor identity primarily in single historical basin? Doesn't our fluid view of culture support carrying memory from ancestral homelands into present life rather than damming it into our plantation? Diaspora theories explicitly describe identities as evolving through time and across our places as wind and water metaphor should expand roots, not shrink them. Proposition: when you praise today's style, aren't you praising forms that carry ancestral code, the music, the code, the culture, all came from ancestral homelands. So what exactly are you saying, proposition? If you agree identity has multi-layers, why insist it be primarily rooted in post-slavery societies? The proposition wants us to believe that our identity should be rooted only in societies created after slavery. But how can you say this, proposition? How can you genuinely argue that diverse societies built on trauma and forced assimilation should now be the only place where we are allowed to root who we are? Even if our identity has changed over time, and yes, it has, it is fundamental to know that where we're coming from. We didn't just spawn in the Caribbean, proposition. We were stripped of our culture, and our identities were overwritten by colonizers who imposed their cultures onto us. Root does not mean the latest place we live. You stated that root, by definition, means the origin, the starting point. You cannot call the aftermath of slavery the origin. Good day, adjudicators, my opponents, and my fellow teammates. My name is Ashante Rodway, and I oppose the motion. This House believes identity should be rooted in societies created after slavery rather than ancestral homelands. To reiterate my teammates' points, post-slavery societies simply continue the cultural erasure that colonialism started. That's how we end up with cultural amnesia, and we can fight for our reparatory justice. She then explained how colonial system reshaped our entire way of life, that reconnecting the ancestral homelands restores the pride and historical understanding that those systems tried to erase. The proposition refuses to confront that the societies built after slavery were constructed on colonial systems, European laws, European religion, European cultures, European norms, and everything was imposed onto us. So if the proposition says our identity should be rooted in these systems, what they're really saying is that our identity should be rooted in the identity of our colonizers, and that makes absolutely no sense. My second speaker added that rooting ourselves in our ancestral homelands will strengthen our political, economical power, resulting in more political pressure being placed onto former colonizers for reparations. The proposition then stated that identity shouldn't be based on all cultures, but Caribbean still keeps on with all culture that was imposed upon them then by their European cultures. The opposition team permanently raised.
Thank you very much, Merl Grove High School, for concluding the opposition's case. And now, to conclude the proposition's case, we welcome the third speaker from Rawlins Academy. Let us make that speaker welcome. Hear, hear.
Thank you. I would like to start by rebuting some of the arguments that have been made by the opposition team. So they suggested that somehow the mixture of cultures within the Caribbean means that culture is rooted in the homelands, but that is not correct, because these cultures have come together during slavery and they have mixed, and they have slowly, over the nearly 2 centuries since emancipation, become a brand new culture, which is rooted within that mixing of cultures, not within the homelands. Secondly, I would like to rebuke the idea that culture and law and norms are all that forms identity. They are not. Identity is also formed by the unique environment in which somebody grows up. So, for example, this includes the physical environment, of which the Caribbean is unique, and also the family environment, of which, of course, again, the Caribbean is unique in their methods of rearing children, of education, and of general lifestyle. We would also like to suggest that identity is influenced by homelands, but yes, again, that does not mean that it is rooted in them. We instead suggest that identity is rooted in where one can find belonging and power, and that is within the nation in which they live. For example, having the vote, having a shared community, having a shared sense of identity, and having a shared area in which a person lives. We would also like to suggest that suggesting that Caribbean culture is rooted in the homeland ignores the suffering of indigenous people within the Caribbean and neglects to mention that their culture has also been formed into the cultures of the modern Caribbean. We would also suggest that the ideas that all identity stems from the homeland, ignores new senses of identity that have developed over time. This is especially significant in the modern age with the rise of technology and the internet, as identity can be formed based off cultures from across the world, and it can also be formed based off education about history and about the future. We would also like to suggest that culture and identity has not been imposed by the white European, but it has been developed, yes, by the unfortunate and tragic suffering of those in the past, but it has been developed by generations of people who remember their ancestors and who consider their past with empathy and dignity and have formed their new identity based on such. And we would also like to finally suggest that how does one define homeland? Is a homeland your cultural? Is it cultural? Is it genetic? Is it where you live? We would like to suggest that homeland is more where somebody lives than where someone has descended from. The homeland is a place in which a person can feel that they belong in a community and that they have a sense of knowing and understanding of that land. Say India, China, West Africa, a person from the Caribbean does not have any knowledge of these areas. They perhaps do not speak the language. And while that is the fault of colonialism, that therefore means that these places are no longer the homeland. Instead, we should be defining homeland as where a person belongs and where they have grown up, where their family is from, and where they feel at home. And we would also like to suggest that identity is something which is deeply personal and is, yes, defined by culture, but is also defined by a sense of family and belonging. And we cannot suggest that all identity should be based in the homeland. We have to suggest that identity should be based in where the family and where the culture, the modern culture, is. And that leads on to our final point, that suggesting that all identity is rooted in the homeland negates the Caribbean's potential. It suggests that all identity in the Caribbean must look back upon the past before slavery. We suggest that a new post-slavery identity allows the Caribbean to develop as its own unique set of states, and that it allows the Caribbean to look forward into the future while recognizing both the impacts of the homeland and slavery, but look forward as its own unique cultural figure and develop into a stronger and more cohesive society. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the third speaker from Rawlins Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to apologize. I omitted to invite our guest adjudicator to introduce herself. Her name is Mia McMorris, and she's from the Center for Reparations Research. So do grant me the privilege of your forgiveness. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to leave this space to deliberate. We'll return shortly with the results. All right, stay tuned. More anon.
We are the Rawlins debate team and we want to be a part of the Reparation debate competition.
I've always loved debating, but this debate has ignited a passion in me like no other. Being a part of the research team last year was such a wonderful experience I hope to relive.
This matters because this issue is a wrong that must be made right. This competition gives us an opportunity to immerse ourselves in this cultural experience.
Okay, I think this about wraps this interview up. When can you start?
Whenever you'd like. I just have a few questions. Where will I be stationed?
You'll be stationed in Jamaica. So you start your journey from Europe to Africa and then finally Jamaica.
Ooh, Jamaica? Where in Jamaica?
La Nueva. You'll be staying there with free housing and free lunch and dinner and breakfast.
Free housing and lunch? I'm about ready to sign my contract. I just have a question. What will be my responsibilities at the City a la Nueva?
Oh, nothing. As a harvester for the Royal African Agency, you will be responsible for cutting, threshing, gathering, winnowing, collecting, unloading, and residue management.
And this comes with extra on top of my base pay of 97,000 USD, right?
No.
No to the bonuses?
No, you'll all be getting 500 USD.
Why? This mean what?
Oh no, but that's to pay for the Indians. You won't be getting paid.
Sorry, the Indians what?
You get free housing though. And enough food to allow you to live. And
Yep, this is me. You're probably confused how I ended up back in the encomienda system. Free housing, free food, but no pay. How's this different? Colonizers used to say, we'll feed you and shelter you, only in exchange for your freedom, your voice, your rights, your sanity. I mean, should I really go on? But anyways, let's go back to the video.
it's a amount of vitamin D.
I think I'm gonna leave.
Where are you going? Didn't you want the job?
I did, but I don't think I'm the best fit for this position.
Isn't she African?
I'm from Germany!
Tied at their hands, tied at their feet, our ancestors traveled bounded across treacherous seas, packed like a tin of sardines.
Slavery was crazy back then, and its effects are still evident now. That's why we believe that we need reparations. My name is Astarte Montague.
And my name is Ashanti Rodriguez.
And my name is Sanjay Donaldson. We are the Merl High School debate team, and this is our video on why we need reparations today. We, as descendants of those who were colonized and enslaved, still live with the damages today. And our colonizers still benefit from the wealth that was stolen from our ancestors.
European colonizers stole the land, labor, and resources from the indigenous people and the Africans, gaining wealth from slavery and exploitation while leaving our nations poor and underdeveloped. This isn't just history. The effects are still here. Poverty, inequality, and economic dependency all trace back to that period.
Reparations are necessary, not as charity, but as justice. They are both acknowledging the crimes of colonialism and the crimes of slavery. This is about repairing the harm done and creating fair opportunities for those who were affected.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this International Reparation Debate Competition. This International Reparation Debate Competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparations so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Ekiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of a people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All criticals observe, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and 2, the harm is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation, and 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo, the history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. Reform is being done for more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Maroons, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use first-hand accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma, and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debate, which is already being done, and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust in diverse classroom. This is credible as the RAN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working, as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. It is in the rationale also
Point of information
that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring 2 substantive. 1, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And 2, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival, reduces emotional harm, and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency, and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are now at the results segment of this match. This match featured 2 very, very good teams. We had a team on side Proposition Rawlins Academy, here from the United Kingdom, and from Jamaica we had Merl High School. They contested a motion that sort of questioned, interrogated whether or not identity should be located by Caribbean, or the identity of Caribbean people should be located within, the post-colonial societies. Those are the societies as they exist now. These are the societies that would have emerged out of post the abolition of enslavement, or should it be that we focus our identity on Africa, we root our identity on places like Africa, China, India, the places where our ancestors originated? All right, so that was a question before us. All right, good. Now Rawlins gives us a number of considerations that we felt were fairly impactful in the match. They tell us that 1, if it is that we locate identity within the lands, the ancestral lands, then it ultimately means that we are doing a disservice. We are abandoning the history and the culture as it exists right now. I think to that we get some response from Merl. Merl tells us that given the trauma and the pain of the era of enslavement and colonialism, it is worth sort of rejecting that kind of experience in favor of an African-centered or an Asian-centered focus for identity. And they say to us that the traumas of enslavement, does not materially benefit us, and so it ought not to be the basis on which we establish our identity. Now, we very much appreciated the challenge, the contestation surrounding what does it mean to root an identity, right? Merl tells us that rooting an identity means to locate your identity solely within a particular space, to which Rawlins tells us that no, that rooting means to essentially locate your identity predominantly in that space, but it is not exclusive to that space. And they contend that in as much as, and I think both teams agree, that in as much as Caribbean societies reflect a melting pot of cultures, of identities, it's an assimilation of various sort of grounds that have brought us to where we are and have created an evolved culture, then that is an evidence of the fact that you can't sort of entirely locate it in an era post the emergence of these particular kinds of cultures. Okay, and we felt that overall, in terms of the contestation of rootedness and what it means to root an identity, we felt that Rawlins College's interpretation was in fact fairer. We felt that had the motion intended for it to be solely rooted, then the word solely, the qualifier solely, would have been used. But you can root something predominantly in a particular space. It doesn't mean that it is to the exclusion of all other considerations and all other sorts of identity sort of focus. Okay. The concern and consideration that we thought was predominant in this debate was whether or not the characterization of the Caribbean societies as they are now is true in either world. Which of the two worlds is a fairer interpretation? We get from Rawlins sort of an admittance that slavery and colonialism would have been negative contributors to the Caribbean societies by and large. And so it's not that they're celebrating that, but then ultimately that sort of feeds somewhat into the narrative of Merl, which we felt was quite fine and quite charitable on the part of Rawlins with respect to their analysis of the contribution from Merl, right? What we felt though, that the nuance that we get from Rawlins was that there have been developments, material developments in Caribbean societies. So, for example, infrastructure, the very emergence of the culture, which we have come to appreciate and we've come to sort of presented on the global scene as a part of the a particular culture within a broader panoply of cultures globally. We felt that that was something to be credited, and we felt that the narrative coming to us from Merl does not sort of engage with that arguably positive outcome, which would have which is manifested within Caribbean societies. Okay. And then we felt as well, a third critique or concern we have results from the fact that we're unclear as to whether or not the formation of identity or the establishment of identity or the predominant focus of identity within a particular space or society is in somewhere or the other, whether or not the history, the painful history as it may be, is relevant in determining whether or not the culture, sorry, that particular culture is deserving of identity location. And so what I mean by that is, yes, we accept that the pain and trauma of enslavement is true and did in fact exist. We don't understand is whether or not that kind of pain and trauma can't also be a part of the identity of the people living within the Caribbean. Why not? We don't get that particular kind of sort of justification sufficiently from Merl. And in fact, we get some pushback from Rawlins when Rawlins tells us that, well, cultures effectively things that don't necessarily deserve your emulation and celebration because it's all good, but that cultures and histories have necessarily painful and regrettable aspects to them, and therefore it is not solely that because it is bad we should entirely reject it or with large, right? And then, of course, final comment that I'll make here is on the question of the reparations quest, or the quest for reparations. Mergrove asks us, why are we seeking reparations if it is that we are comfortable sort of holding on to the identities which is reflected in Caribbean societies right now? We hear a question asked. We're not certain as to the particular impact of that question. We're uncertain as to whether or not that question is, in fact, strong enough to propel the debate closer to the side of Merl Grove High School. So, Merl Grove, when you ask a question in a debate, help us to appreciate the implication of the answers that it would be necessary from the vantage point of your opposition. And of course, tell us why that kind of that world results or the response that results from that side of the debate is particularly bad in the broader context of the debate. All right. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, it was an interesting match. Again, we had two teams, one from the UK, that's Rawlins Academy, the other from Jamaica, Merl Grove High School. And the scores are as follows: 274 points as compared to 283 points. The winners of this match, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is Rawlins Academy, the proposition team. And of course, we invite both teams to unmute their microphones and inform us, well, sort of exchange, pleasantries with each other, beginning with Merl Grove.
Congratulations, Rawlins Academy.
Congratulations, Mulgrove. You guys were absolutely superb and we love debating you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You guys were amazing.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so very, very much. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, who was the best debater in this match? The best debater here is from the winning team from Rawlins Academy, and that is in fact the second speaker. That's the Deputy Prime Minister from Rawlins College. Congratulations, Madam Deputy Prime Minister, on securing the highest score in this match.
Thank you so much. Also, can we just say from our schools, thank you so much to all the judges and people who made this debate possible, all the technical people, the scorers, because it was just a wonderful debate.
All right, thank you very much. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that brings our debate to an end. Congratulations to Rawlins Academy for winning this match. And of course, very well tried to Merl Grove High School, whose journey unfortunately comes to an end in this competition. Hoping to see you next year in the competition, Merl Grove High School. All right. All right, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to an end. We will now hop off this platform, and please rejoin us in a few moments from now when the second match in this round of competition commences. Goodbye.